Now let me ask you again, how many of you believe that you're a leader? And every person who didn't raise their hand, this sermon series is for you. Because we all are leaders in a variety of places, in a variety of times, for a variety of reasons. So if you have any questions, see Abigail. She's going to be out in the fellowship hall. We want to encourage you to seriously consider being a part of this free training. Now, it's a gift to Chapel Hill worth about $150,000 for 40 people to go through this training at the Kansas Leadership Center. So if you have questions, see Abigail, and you'll be hearing more about this in the month to come. So today, we're going to look at this topic of uncharted territory, journeying through the book of Exodus, looking at Moses and Zipporah, as we all explore how to become better leaders in the realms in which we live and move and have our being, where we work and play. Everybody's a leader. Amen? So I'm going to need an amen crowd today, because if the first service is any indication, I'm going to have to work hard at keeping you connected to what I'm talking about today. What does it mean, uncharted territory, when we use that phrase? It simply means we've not been there before. We don't know what to do. Now, some of you know what that's like personally. Some of you know what that's like to be a part of an organization that comes up against it. We're all Americans. We're living in a different world today. Aren't we? There's uncharted territory all over the place. Now, just to make this a little personal, this is our front yard. This is uncharted territory. I have never been there before. Those of you who know me, I take great pride in having a green lawn. And I like the lawn to be a certain way. I make sure that I do it myself so that I can't complain if it's not like I want it to be. And I have won the neighborhood award for having the best lawn for several years in a row. But look at my lawn now. This is uncharted territory. This is the whole yard. And when you look at it, what does it say to you? It is D-E-A-D, dead. I can't spell. It's dead. This causes me so much consternation. Now, why is my lawn dead? A lack of water. A lack of time. The crazy Kansas weather. All of that is right. But guess what happened? The neighbor what? No, I thought about that, but I quickly repented of that idea that somebody was out to get me. So, a member of our church, Drew Wilson, is the manager of Ryan Lawn and Tree. And so I said to Drew, I need your help. First of all, I thought maybe that his company had burned the lawn with fertilizer. Now, when we're in uncharted territory, there's always a lot of blame, right? Okay, who's at fault here? And Drew said, well, guess what? We're seeing this all over Wichita, and I want to show you the part with the tree. Look what's happening around the tree. He said, in Wichita, because of the dry winter, the trees sucked up the water, and the trees won the battle. And the lawns are dying. And he's going to help me get this fixed. So if you need a lawn service company, I highly recommend Drew. He also does the church's lawn. But here's why I tell you that, is that when it comes to leadership, these two guys at Harvard, Heifetz and Linsky, teach us something very important. That there are technical problems and technical solutions to those problems where all you have to do with a problem like this is call somebody like that. Right? That is a technical problem. The solutions are at hand. You just need best practices or best practitioners, and they can tell you what to do. Drew came out on Friday and used his verticutter and cut down into this rock-hard soil. And then I turned on the sprinkler system to water that, and now I have to cover the sprinkler. This is just uncharted territory, isn't it? But there are other kinds of challenges called adaptive. And adaptive challenges, you see, cannot be solved easily or quickly. And they require adaptation. And there's only one kind of person on planet Earth that likes change. Do you know who that is? It's a baby with a soiled diaper. So whenever somebody says, well, I love change, I always say to them, yes, if you're initiating it, but what do you do with change that you're not initiating? Nobody really likes change because we're creatures of habit. But there are adaptive challenges that come our way that don't change easily or quickly, but they require a shift, an adaptation in behaviors and attitudes and habits. And it doesn't come easy. And I want to give you an example. It's the example of boredom. Do you realize that most people in America are bored, according to the research? And if you were to evaluate your own self on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being high, what's your boredom factor? And you say, well, I don't feel bored, but let me just share some of the research. Do you realize that every day 30 to 90% of Americans feel bored, according to George Gallup? And he was asked, well, what would you, if you had to really put a stake in the stand, how many Americans feel bored all the time? He'd say at least 57%, over half. And if you want to get in touch with the research that really jars you, 91 to 98% of younger people say they're bored on a daily basis. That's people 34 years of age and younger. Bored. And this stat really got me. 25-year-olds are 4 times as likely to be bored as a 45-year-old. Now, do you feel bored? Let's look at the definition. This is one of those words we assume we know what it means. Boredom, you see, is marked by an empty feeling, as well as a sense of frustration with that emptiness. And when you're bored, you may have a limited attention span and a lack of interest in what's happening around you. You feel apathetic, you feel fatigued, you feel nervous, you feel jittery. Now, I would not have associated those things with boredom, but the research says that most people are asking the question, is there meaning and purpose to life? Why am I here? And some people say they're so bored with their jobs that they're just going through the motions and just taking up space is the feeling they have. Now, is that you? So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bored are you? And why am I even asking this question of boredom in relationship to adaptive challenge? Because I'm convinced that as we explore the character of Moses, Moses is completely bored out of his mind. Do I have your attention yet? I'm convinced that we look at this picture of Moses, and what do we see? Macho, strength, power. I'm in control. I'm living out my mission. And that's Hollywood. That's not the Hebrew Bible. So what we're going to do today, beginning today, and let me just warn you, we're going to be talking in commas rather than periods, is that I'm going to be taking us through the Hebrew Bible. This is my Hebrew Bible from seminary. I was so blessed to have a rabbi teach me Hebrew Bible. And if you were to go up here on Woodlawn Street to Hebrew congregation, this is the Bible that they use to read from. And it has Hebrew and it has their interpretation of English. And one of the things that the Jewish rabbi said to me that has always stuck with me is he said, I have one request of you. Would you please make sure that you don't do 2 things? Number 1, don't ever paraphrase the Hebrew Scriptures. Don't say, now I'm going to tell you a story about Moses, and here's some of the highlights of his life. Don't do that. Well, I said, Rabbi, why not do that? He said, because you miss things. We don't do that in our tradition. We don't paraphrase. We don't say, well, let me tell you about the story of Moses, and here's some highlight. You read the text, and you let the text speak to you. Second thing he said, and I'm glad we have an amen section over here in Reverend Melker. He's my buddy. I appreciate it. Keeps me going here, yes. So the second thing he said is, please don't Christianize the Hebrew Scriptures. Don't take your notions of Christianity and put them on to the characters of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Because when you do that, you lose meaning and purpose of what's happening there. And he said, my pledge to you is I won't, and this is a quote, I won't Jewicize your Christian Scriptures. Where I'll take my Jewish notion and say, well, this is what that really means. Okay? Well, that's fair, isn't it? Are you bored? Are you bored yet? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into these stories because they're so incredibly rich and powerful. So if you have a Bible, you can try to follow along, but I'm going to read the English direct translation from the Hebrew. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman, this is Exodus 2 in case you're wondering, the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. Now there's a sermon in that, but we don't have time to go there. How many of you have taken your beautiful boys and hid them for 3 months? So that's what I learned from this rabbi, is that everything in here has meaning and purpose. Don't ignore a bit of it. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him, and she put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile, while her maidens walked along the Nile. And she spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. And when she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy, crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses. In the Hebrew tradition, every name matters. And Moses means, I drew him out of the water. Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their toil. Now hear this. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen, and he turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he found 2 Hebrews fighting. So he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" He retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" And Moses was frightened and thought, "Then the matter is known." When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh. He arrived in the land of Midian and sat down beside a well. Now there's another sermon there, but that's for another time. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled their troughs to water with their father's flock. But the shepherds came and drove them off. And Moses rose to their defense, and he watered their flock. Now, let me just connect some dots here. You have the character of Moses. He has been born. He was raised in Pharaoh's home. He went to Harvard. Let's put this in plain English. He had the best of everything, the best of education, the best of food, the best of housing, the best of clothing. He had the best of everything that was available. That's how he was raised. But when he sees one of his kinsfolk Now the question is, how did he know that they were his kinsfolk? But that's another sermon for another time. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. And what did he do? He took him out. He stepped in. He got involved. The very next day, 2 Hebrews are fighting. He said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" Fast forward, he leaves the land, goes to the land of Midian, sits beside the well. The 7 daughters come to get water, and they fill their trough in order to feed the flock, and the shepherds come, and what do they do to the women? They're bullying them. And Moses rose to their defense. Now, are you hearing this? You have this character of Moses who is stepping in to be an advocate. In the Hebrew tradition, the word justice, mishpat, does not mean I see something and it bothers me and I think, well, that's just really sorry. I'm just really sad. That's just terrible that that's happening. That's not justice in the Hebrew tradition. Justice in the Hebrew tradition is to be an advocate for somebody who cannot be an advocate for themselves. It is to step into the space and say, this is not going to happen. And that's what Moses did when he saw the Egyptian beating the Hebrew. He stepped in. Now, am I advocating murder? No, but I'm telling you what, he stepped in. And he became an advocate. The next thing that happens, he sees 2 guys fighting. He steps in and says, "Stop fighting. I know who started this fight." Now, don't you think there was at least one person say, "Moses, mind your own business. You shouldn't get involved in these things." And then he leaves the land in order to go to the land of Midian because Moses is on his tail and the women are being bullied. And what does he do? He rises to their defense. What does this tell you about the character of Moses? What is the passion that is burning in his bones? Justice. My rabbi friend, he pastored the largest Jewish congregation in Kansas City at the time. And he said, we don't say justice. We say justice. It's the kind of thing that rises up within you, and you just have to do something. You have to get involved. You can't just say, oh, that's a terrible thing that's happening over there. You step into the space and you say, I am going to be an advocate for the persons who cannot be advocates for themselves. That's justice. That's mishpat. That's Moses. Well, we got to move on. But let me ask you, before I do that, what does that tell us about Moses? Why is he so passionate about justice? And to put it in plain English, if you were to use one word to describe all of those events, it starts with a B, and it's a problem in our world today. Do you know what that B word is? Bullying. Why do you think Moses is so passionate about bullying? Because he was bullied. Today we're going to be talking about what it is that burns within our souls that causes us to say, like Moses, I cannot stand this one thing, fill in the blank, because I cannot stand it no more, as Popeye said. I've got to do something about it. What is that in you? I guarantee you, if you want to get in touch with that, you got to look at your childhood. What happened to you that caused you to say, I'm never going to see somebody else go through that same thing? Why was Moses bullied? Because he was different. And how do they know he was different? Yes, you can be raised in Pharaoh's home and still be different. We know this about what happens with people. People step in and say, that person's different, and then that person gets picked on. That person gets bullied. right? Now, some of you know that personally. That's how this works. But it's not the end of the story. So, they go back, the women, they go back to their father. Your Christian Bible, our Christian Bible may use Jethro. I don't like to use Jethro. I like the original Hebrew, which is Ruel. Rule is commonly pronounced. Because Jethro, I think of the guy in the hat on TV. What's that? Beverly Hillbillies. How does that song go? Da-dun, da-da-dun, da-da-dun, da-da. You know that. So every time I read Jethro here, I just go to Jed. What was his name? Clampett? You get it. So I like Rule because my mind just goes crazy places. So, can you use Rule with me? When they returned to their father Ruel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today? You're not supposed to be back this soon." And they answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." And he said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why did you leave the man? Ask him to break bread." All of that is a Hebrew way of saying, this person has done justice. See, that's why Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice? Justice is not looking at something and saying, oh, that's terribly bad that that's happening. It's doing something about what you see. And in the Hebrew tradition, when somebody does justice in your behalf, you take them in and you make them as your own. And that's why when it says breaking bread, that's the most intimate thing that you can do in Middle Eastern culture is to break bread with a person. And so Ruel is saying to his daughters, where is he? And what does he first say? He says, why'd you leave him? Go get him. He's one of us. I have to go off on a tangent for a quick moment because this gives me the opportunity. But recently, when people go to other churches out of town and the like, I love it when they come back and tell me about their experience because we can learn a lot. So this person came to me and said, Jeff, I went to this church during Lent and the pastor's whole sermon was, people of different races should not intermarry. There should not be intermarrying of different cultures or different nations or different races. None of that. That is against the Bible, and if you have that in your family, disown them. So this woman said to me, Jeff, I don't claim to know the Bible very well, but is that really true? And I said, no. And even though in this story Moses was genuinely a Hebrew, the beauty of this story is that Ruel thought he was an Egyptian. He's different. And yet he's invited in, and what does he encourage? For him to marry his daughter based on the content of his character rather than the color of his skin. I love the amen section. It's dangerous, so I got to be more concise or we'll never get through this. So, and here's the thing. Moses said, I want you to be my family. That's essentially what's happening here. And Ruel is saying, I want you to be our family. And so Moses consented to stay, and Ruel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. We're going to hear about her in the weeks to come. And she bore a son and named him Gershom, which means I have been a stranger in a foreign land. You hear that? I've been a stranger in a foreign land. That is a biblical way of saying that person who's different has become one of us. Oh, this is so incredibly rich. Well, a long time after that, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from the bondage rose up to God. And God heard their moaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Hear this, please. In the Hebrew Bible, one of the most major themes that often gets ignored is that God sees the suffering of His people. God sees the suffering of the Israelites. God sees the suffering of the Gentiles. God sees the suffering of you. God sees the suffering of me. God takes notice of suffering. And if you're in a personal valley right now and you're experiencing a lot of suffering, the thing that I hope you will take confidence in and comfort from is that God notices what you're going through. And that is what led then to the call of Moses. Now see, I've got to get to business here. Not that we're just messing around or anything. But this leads us to Moses in the burning bush. Now, are you still with me or are you bored out of your mind? Okay. So now Moses comes into the family. And guess what he does? He joins the family business. And what does that mean? He gets sent to the wilderness. To do what? Tend sheep and goats. Now let me ask you, if justice is burning in your bones, and you're sent for 40 years to tend the family business of sheep and goats, do you hear the disconnect? He's bored. Boredom happens when you do something that you're not created to do. Boredom happens when you're taking up space just fulfilling somebody else's expectations. Boredom happens when somebody says, now this is your destiny and it's your job to fulfill it. That's exactly what happened to Moses. Now please don't misunderstand. Ruel had a very good intention, but the result was the same. Moses was bored out of his mind, tending sheep and goats, and what burns in his bones is a passion for justice. How often in those 40 years do you think Moses had opportunity to do justice? Not very often, because the text doesn't even tell us. Well, so what does he do? It says that Moses drove the flock into the wilderness, and where did he go? This is another interesting thing. Maybe it's only interesting to me, but in the Hebrew Bible, which Jesus then reinterprets for us, is that when people got bored, they did one of three things. They went to the mountains, they went to the lakes, the water, or they went to the desert. And Moses goes to the mountain. And what happens? This. Now, can I just preach just a little bit of this? Thank you. It only takes one. It's just like an... So, an angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, yet the bush was not consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? Now, verse 3, this is of chapter 3. Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? If you leave here today, I hope that you will take this question with you and let it resonate in the whole of your soul. I must turn aside to look at the marvelous sights. I must turn aside to look at the marvelous sights. Why doesn't the bush burn up? I so relate to Elizabeth Barrett Browning when she says, earth is crammed with heaven and every common bush afire with God, but only he or she who sees takes off his or her shoes. The rest sit around, and what do? They pluck blackberries. That's a poet's way of saying they're bored out of their mind. If you leave here today, may you notice the burning bushes that God puts in your midst. That's what Moses did. He said, I'm going to pay attention. You know what the Jewish rabbis used to say? Was this a one-time experience? The Jewish rabbis say, no, that bush was burning for a very long time from the point that the Israelites were made slaves. That bush started to burn, and God was just waiting for somebody to notice. There's bushes burning all around us. And if you're like me, sometimes I don't even notice them. Now, there's one other thing I just have to cover, okay? Thank you. Oh my goodness, this is so powerful. So, Moses and God have this interchange, right? Now, I'm going to violate the Jewish rabbis' orders because of time. Now, what does that say about our culture, right? Okay, thank you. So, Moses says, I'm going to just use some plain English. Moses says to God, okay, I'm seeing this bush. What's the point? I've noticed my people suffering. I'm calling you. Well, what am I supposed to do? You're supposed to talk. Well, you know I have a speech impediment. I've got that covered. Well, I don't think you really want me to do this. I want you. Well, don't you know that I'm a little slow? I'm a little slow in speech. We say speech impediment. It's really does an injustice to what he's saying. I'm slow in speech. You know what that means in the Hebrew? That means that he can think things, but getting it out is more difficult. That may or may not involve a speech impediment. And he's saying, God, somebody else. I pass. No, I want you. I want you. Well, okay, so I'm not able to get out of this, so who am I supposed to say sent me? Because after all, I'm just this lowly shepherd. Why would anybody believe me? Well, I'll be with you. Yeah, but who's sending me? Who am I to say is sending me? And here's the thing that God said. And here's what's beautiful. God says this to Moses, and he never said it to any other person before or since. Here's the Hebrew. Ayeh, asher, ayeh. Now, most of us have heard this interpreted as I am who I am. That's how we've Christianized the Jewish scriptures, because we want it to match Jesus saying, I am. But that's not really what it means. And guess what? Nobody really knows what it means. And that's precisely the point. It was only for Moses. And when Moses kept pushing, well, what am I supposed to say? He said, you say, Ayeh sent me to you. Well, what does Ayeh mean? Nobody knows. Now, we have some clues, but they're only clues. One is, I'll be what I want to be. You know, in the Jewish tradition, God is God and we're not. That's a Christian idea too, but the Jews get it really well. I'll be what I want to be, and I will be what tomorrow demands. That's as close as we can get, and it's only a guess. Here's the point, according to my Jewish rabbi professor. When God calls you, and you, and you, and you, and me, it's personal. It's your call. And God speaks to you. And how dare me say, well, Buzz, God spoke to you that way? That just can't be God. That's dangerous. Because this is a personal, living God speaking to each of us. That's why this German theologian says, at the end of the day, this is a divine mystery. And it's a mystery which ought to terrify us and fascinate us. And it ought to leave us in reverential awe. And yet we should be attracted to it, drawn into it. It should be incredibly powerful for us to think about the fact that the God of the universe is saying, Moses, 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 I want you. So here's how I want to close, is that if you and I are going to get in touch with our leadership, we have to get in touch with our passion. And Moses was crystal clear about his passion, which was to do justice. What is your passion? What makes your heart beat faster? What is it that causes the fire to burn within your soul? You see, the Jewish rabbis of old would say that the burning bush is not just about the fact that the bush is burning to symbolize the slavery of the Israelites, but it is also burning because it is a sign of what's to be burning in our souls. That when we get in touch with what's burning in our souls, that's the essence of our call. And it is our prayer that this sermon series will be a way of helping us get in touch with the God-given passion. I close with this quote. I promise I'll close. But I have to tell you this. This is so powerful to me. Frederick Buechner, the Presbyterian minister, says, the kind of work God usually calls you to is the kind of work that A, that you most need to do, and B, that the world most needs to have done. If you really get a kick out of your work, you've probably met requirement A. But if your work is writing TV deodorant commercials, the chances are you've missed requirement B. On the other hand, if your work is being a doctor in a leper colony, you've probably met requirement B. But if most of the time you're bored and depressed by it, the chances are you've not only bypassed A, but you're probably not helping patients feel better. The place God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. What's your passion? Let's have some time for silent prayer.